the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, where autumn leaves painted the sidewalks in shades of amber and gold, 68-year-old Marine veteran Robert Mitchell lived a life that revolved entirely around his golden retriever, Duke. Their story began 5 years earlier on what should have been the darkest day for both of them, but instead became the day two broken souls found salvation in each other. Robert had entered the county animal shelter on a cold November afternoon, not really knowing why he was there. His wife had passed away from cancer just 3 months prior, and the emptiness of their home had become suffocating. The silence was deafening. Every room echoed with memories of her laughter, her voice, her presence. His daughter Sarah had been begging him to consider adopting a dog, thinking companionship might help ease his crushing grief. Robert had resisted for weeks, insisting nothing could fill the void had left behind. But on that particular day, something drew him through those shelter doors. He walked past cage after cage, seeing hopeful eyes and wagging tails, but feeling nothing. Then, in the very last kennel in the back corner, he saw Duke. The golden retriever wasn't jumping or barking like the other dogs. He was curled in the corner, his beautiful coat matted and dull, his eyes filled with a sadness that Robert recognized immediately. It was the same look he saw in his own mirror every morning. "That one's been here 4 months, the shelter worker, a young woman named Jessica, said softly. He was abandoned by his first family when they moved. Then he got adopted 2 months ago, but they brought him back last week. Said he had too much anxiety, wouldn't stop whining at night. Tomorrow is his last day. We're out of space and—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Robert understood what last day meant. Robert approached the cage slowly and knelt down. Duke lifted his head and their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. They were both abandoned, both broken, both waiting for their last day. Robert's hand trembled as he reached through the bars. Duke hesitated, then slowly crawled forward and pressed his nose against Robert's palm. "I'll take him," Robert said, his voice cracking with emotion for the first time since funeral. The shelter workers were shocked but delighted. Jessica processed the paperwork with tears in her eyes, waiving the adoption fee entirely. "You're saving each other," she whispered as she handed Robert the leash. Those first weeks were harder than Robert expected. Duke would whine throughout the night, suffering from nightmares. He was terrified of being left alone, even for a moment. If Robert went to the bathroom, Duke would panic and scratch at the door. The anxiety was overwhelming for both of them. Robert's neighbors complained about the barking. His daughter Sarah worried he'd made a mistake. But Robert refused to give up on Duke, just as Duke refused to leave his side. Slowly, painstakingly, they healed each other. Robert started waking up early to take Duke for long walks through Riverside Park, something used to do with him before she got sick. The routine gave Robert purpose, a reason to get out of bed. Duke's anxiety gradually lessened as he learned to trust that Robert would always come back. The whining stopped. The scratching stopped. Instead, an unbreakable bond formed. By the end of that first year, they were inseparable. Duke slept on the floor beside Robert's bed, his breathing a comforting rhythm in the darkness. Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, Duke would gently nose Robert's hand, signaling it was time for their walk. Rain or shine, through Ohio's brutal winters and humid summers, they never missed a day. Their favorite spot was the pond in Riverside Park, where ducks gathered and willow trees dipped their branches into the water. Robert would sit on their special bench, the one with the bronze plaque that read "In memory of Mitchell," who loved this place, and Duke would rest his head on Robert's knee. Sometimes Robert would talk to Duke about, sharing stories and memories. Duke would listen intently, his amber eyes focused completely on Robert's face, as if he truly understood every word. "You know what, Duke," Robert would often say, scratching behind the dog's soft ears, "would have loved you. She always said a home wasn't complete without a dog's paw prints on the floor." The neighborhood had grown to love them both. Mrs., who lived 3 houses down, always had treats ready when they walked by. The mailman would stop to throw Duke's tennis ball a few times during his route. Children playing in their yards would call out, "Hi, Duke." "Hi, Mr. Mitchell." The pair had become a fixture of the community, as reliable as the sunrise. Robert's daughter Sarah visited every Sunday for dinner, and her two young children, Emma and Jack, adored their grandfather's dog. Duke was gentle with them, letting 7-year-old Emma dress him up in silly hats and allowing 5-year-old Jack to use him as a pillow during movie time. Sarah would watch her father with Duke and see something she thought she'd lost forever: happiness. Her dad smiled again. He laughed again. He had a reason to live again. "Dad, you saved Duke's life," Sarah told him one evening as they watched the kids play with the dog in the backyard. Robert shook his head slowly, his eyes glistening. "No, sweetheart, Duke saved mine. When your mother died, I didn't want to go on. Everything felt meaningless. But this boy here," he gestured to Duke, who was letting Emma put a crown on his head, "he needed me. He gave me purpose when I had none. He gave me love when I thought I'd never feel it again. We saved each other." That's how it had been for 5 beautiful years. Man and dog, veteran and rescue, two souls who had found each other when they both needed saving most. They had weathered storms together, celebrated quiet joys together, and built a life together that was simple but profoundly meaningful. Neither of them could have known that their bond was about to face the ultimate test, one that would not only prove the depth of their connection, but would also touch the hearts of millions of people around the world. Their story was about to become legendary, and it would all begin with an ordinary October morning that would turn extraordinary in the most terrifying way possible. October 15th began like any other Tuesday morning in Robert Mitchell's carefully ordered life. The alarm clock read 5:47 a.m. when Duke's cold nose gently nudged Robert's hand, 13 minutes before the actual alarm would sound. Robert smiled in the darkness, the way he did every morning at this familiar ritual. Duke never needed an alarm. His internal clock was more reliable than any electronic device. "Good morning, buddy," Robert whispered, scratching Duke behind his ears in that special spot that made the dog's back leg twitch with pleasure. Duke's tail thumped against the hardwood floor, a sound that had become Robert's favorite way to start each day. Robert pushed himself out of bed, feeling the usual stiffness in his knees and lower back, the price of age and old military injuries. He'd turned 68 last month, and while he kept himself in decent shape with their daily walks, he could feel time catching up with him. He'd been meaning to schedule that cardiology appointment Sarah kept nagging him about. His father had died of a heart attack at 64, and his doctor had mentioned something about hereditary risk factors during his last checkup 6 months ago. But Robert felt fine, strong even, so he'd put it off the way men of his generation often did with medical matters. He pulled on his favorite Cleveland brown sweatshirt, the one had bought him for Christmas 10 years ago, now faded and worn but irreplaceable. Duke sat patiently by the bedroom door, his leash already in his mouth, a trick Robert had taught him years ago that never failed to make him chuckle. "Always one step ahead, aren't you?" Robert said, taking the leash and clipping it to Duke's collar. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of approaching winter. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange. Their breath created small clouds in the October chill. Duke pulled eagerly toward Riverside Park, the same route they'd walked more than 1,800 times over the past 5 years. Mrs. was already out tending to her garden despite the early hour. "Good morning, Robert." "Morning, Duke," she called out, waving her gardening glove. "Morning," Robert called back. "Those chrysanthemums are looking beautiful." "I'll bring some by later," she promised, and Duke wagged his tail as they passed her white picket fence. They walked their familiar path through the neighborhood, passing the mailman who was just starting his route. "Early bird catches the worm," Robert joked, as he did at least twice a week. "You know it," Robert replied with a grin. Everything was perfect, normal, safe. They reached Riverside Park at 6:23 a.m., exactly on schedule. The morning joggers were out in full force, the same faces Robert had seen for years. There was the young mother who ran every morning before her kids woke up. There was Tom and his beagle, Max. There was the elderly couple, the Johnsons, who walked hand in hand despite being in their 80s. Robert and Duke made their way to the pond, where the ducks were already gliding across the mirror-like surface, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. This was Duke's favorite part of the walk. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Duke's worn tennis ball, green and fuzzy, and covered in teeth marks from countless games of fetch. "Ready, boy?" Robert asked, and Duke's whole body vibrated with excitement, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end swayed. Robert threw the ball in a high arc toward the open grass near the pond. Duke took off like a golden bullet, his powerful legs propelling him forward with the joy and energy of a dog half his age. Robert watched him run and felt that familiar warmth in his chest, the gratitude for this second chance at happiness, for this loyal companion who had pulled him back from the edge of despair. Duke caught the ball on the second bounce and immediately bounded back, dropping it at Robert's feet with a proud look that said, "Again, throw it again." Robert laughed and threw the ball once more, watching Duke race after it with undiminished enthusiasm. They'd been playing for about 10 minutes when Robert noticed something odd. His left arm felt strange, heavy and tingly, like he'd slept on it wrong. He rubbed it absently, thinking nothing of it. Duke returned with the ball, but this time Robert felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The world tilted slightly, and he had to plant his feet wider to keep his balance. "Just a second, boy," Robert said, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. That's when the pain hit. It started as a pressure in the center of his chest, like someone had placed a heavy weight there. Within seconds, the pressure transformed into a crushing, burning sensation that spread across his entire chest and radiated down his left arm. Robert gasped, dropping the tennis ball, his vision blurred at the edges. "No," he whispered, recognizing what was happening. "Not now, please, not now." Duke immediately sensed something was wrong. The dog dropped the ball and rushed to Robert's side, whining with concern. Robert tried to reach for his cell phone in his pocket, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. The pain was intensifying, stealing his breath, crushing him from the inside. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the grass near the pond. The impact jarred him, and he rolled onto his side, clutching his chest. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, worse than any combat injury, worse than anything he could have imagined. Duke began barking frantically, a sharp, desperate sound that shattered the peaceful morning. The dog ran in tight circles around Robert's fallen form, then stopped to lick his face, as if trying to wake him from a bad dream. When that didn't work, Duke's barks became more urgent, more panicked. Robert's vision was fading, the beautiful morning sky turning gray at the edges. He could hear Duke barking as if from very far away. He wanted to tell his faithful friend that it would be okay, that he was sorry, that Duke should go find help. But he couldn't form the words. His mouth wouldn't work. Nothing would work. Through his dimming consciousness, Robert heard someone shouting, footsteps running toward him. It was the young mother who jogged past them every morning. "Oh my God, sir, can you hear me?" Dropped to her knees beside him, her phone already in her hand. Her voice was shaking as she spoke to the 911 operator. "Yes, I need an ambulance at Riverside Park by the duck pond. A man has collapsed. He's conscious but not responding. He's clutching his chest. I think it's a heart attack." Duke continued barking, trying to push his way between and Robert, not understanding why this stranger was touching his owner. Gently but firmly held Duke back with one hand while keeping her other hand on Robert's shoulder. "Stay with me, sir. Help is coming, just stay with me." In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. Robert's last conscious thought before the darkness claimed him completely was of Duke, his faithful companion, his savior, his best friend. What would happen to Duke? Who would take care of him? The paramedics arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. They quickly assessed Robert's condition, hooking him up to monitors, starting an IV, loading him onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency. Their movements were swift and professional, their voices calm but commanding. Suspected myocardial infarction. BP is 90/60 and dropping. Let's move, people. As they lifted the stretcher, Duke tried to jump up onto it, desperate to stay with Robert. Had to wrap both arms around the dog's chest to hold him back. Duke was strong, pulling with all his might, his claws digging into the grass. "I'm sorry, boy, you can't go," one of the paramedics said, genuine sympathy in his voice as they loaded Robert into the ambulance. "Animals aren't allowed." Duke watched through restraining arms as they closed the ambulance doors, sealing Robert away from him. The vehicle's engine roared to life, the siren screamed, and then it was speeding away down the park path, leaving Duke behind. The moment's grip loosened just slightly. Duke lunged forward, trying to chase the ambulance. He managed to run about 50 feet before caught his leash again, pulling him to a stop. Duke strained against the leash with all his strength, crying out in a way that made his heart break into pieces. "I know, buddy, I know," she said through her own tears, reading the address on Duke's collar tag. "Let's get you home. Your family will know what to do." But Duke didn't want to go home. He wanted Robert. As led the reluctant, whimpering dog away from the park, Duke kept looking back over his shoulder, watching the spot where the ambulance had disappeared, as if willing it to return. Neither of them knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Richardson's hands were still shaking as she walked Duke through the quiet morning streets toward Robert's address. The golden retriever pulled against the leash with every step, constantly looking back toward the park, whimpering in a way that made one cry all over again. She was a mother of 2 young children, and she understood the primal panic of being separated from someone you loved. Duke's distress was palpable, radiating from every fiber of his being. "We're going to find your family, buddy," said softly, though she wasn't sure the dog could hear her over his own anxious whining. "They'll know what to do. They'll take you to see him." But with every step away from the park, Duke's anxiety intensified. He kept stopping, planting his paws firmly on the sidewalk, trying to turn back. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his eyes wild with confusion and fear. In his mind, he just watched his entire world get taken away in a screaming metal box, and nothing made sense anymore. The walk that should have taken 10 minutes stretched to nearly 20 because of Duke's resistance. When they finally reached Robert's modest 2-story home on Maple Street, felt a wave of relief. Surely someone would be home, a wife, a family member, someone who could take charge of this heartbroken dog. She knocked on the front door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello, is anyone home? Your dog needs you," called out, pressing the doorbell repeatedly. The chimes echoed through the house, but no footsteps came to answer. Duke sat on the porch, his ears pressed flat against his head, his tail tucked between his legs. He looked utterly defeated, and his heart broke a little more. She pulled out her phone and tried calling the number listed on Duke's collar tag, but it rang through to voicemail, Robert's voice, cheerful and strong, asking callers to leave a message. "Hi, my name is Richardson. I was at Riverside Park this morning when Robert collapsed. I called 911 and they took him to the hospital. I have your dog, Duke, at your house, but nobody's home. Please call me back as soon as possible." She left her number and hung up, feeling helpless. Looking at Duke's miserable face made a decision. She couldn't just leave him on the porch. She tried the back gate and found it unlocked, a small blessing. Robert's backyard was well maintained, with a wooden fence about 5 feet tall, a covered porch area, and a water bowl near the back door. It was safe and secure. "Come on, Duke. "Let's get you settled," said gently, leading the reluctant dog through the gate. She found a bowl in the outdoor storage bin and filled it with fresh water. There was a bag of dog food on the covered porch, so she poured some into another bowl. Duke ignored both completely, his eyes fixed on the gate she'd just closed. Spent another 10 minutes making sure Duke had everything he needed. She found a blanket and placed it in a dry spot on the porch. She left another note on the front door, this one more detailed, with her phone number written in large letters. She even called Mercy General Hospital to check if they had information about Robert Mitchell's condition, but they couldn't share patient information with a stranger. Before she left, knelt down beside Duke one last time. "Someone will come for you, boy, I promise. Your person is getting help. He's going to be okay." She stroked his soft golden fur, and for a moment Duke leaned into her touch. Then she stood, gave him one last sad smile, and left through the gate, making sure it was securely latched. Duke watched her go through the fence slats, and then he was alone. The morning stretched into afternoon. Duke paced the perimeter of the backyard endlessly, his paws wearing a path in the grass along the fence line. He would stop periodically to sniff the air, trying to catch Robert's scent, trying to understand where his owner had gone. The untouched food sat in the bowl. The water remained at the same level. Duke had no interest in anything except finding Robert. By 2 p.m., Duke's packing had become frantic. He would run to the gate, scratch at it, then run to the fence, jump up against it, then return to the gate. Over and over in an endless loop of desperate searching. Low whines turned into occasional barks, sharp sounds of frustration and fear. Mrs. from 3 houses down heard the barking and came to investigate around 3 p.m. She peered over the fence and saw Duke in his agitated state, clearly distressed. "Duke, honey, where's Robert?" she called out, but Duke barely acknowledged her, too focused on his mission to escape and find his owner. Mrs. tried calling Robert's phone. No answer. She knocked on the front door and found his note. Her hand flew to her mouth as she read about Robert's collapse and hospitalization. She immediately called Robert's daughter Sarah, whose number she had for emergencies. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Mrs., is everything okay?" "Sarah, honey, it's your father. He collapsed at the park this morning. Someone took him to the hospital, I think Mercy General. Duke is in the backyard and he's very upset." There was a sharp intake of breath, then Sarah's voice tight with panic. "What, when, is he alive?" "I don't know any details, sweetheart. The note says a woman named was there. She left her number. I'm looking at Duke right now, and the poor thing is beside himself. I'm on my way. I'm in Columbus for work, but I'll leave right now. Can you stay with Duke until I get there? It'll take me 2 hours." "Of course, dear, drive safely. I'll watch over him." But watching over Duke proved nearly impossible. Mrs. sat on Robert's back porch, trying to calm the dog with soft words and gentle pats, but Duke wouldn't settle. He continued his frantic packing, his anxiety escalating with each passing hour. By 4 p.m., his paws were leaving muddy tracks across the lawn from his constant movement. Sarah arrived at 5:30 p.m., looking exhausted and terrified. Her eyes were red from crying during the drive. Mrs. filled her in on what little she knew while Sarah unlocked the back door and tried to coax Duke inside. "Come on, Duke. Come inside, boy. I know you're scared." "I'm scared too," Sarah said, her voice breaking. Duke looked at her with recognition. He knew Sarah loved Sarah, but even her familiar presence couldn't override his desperate need to find Robert. He reluctantly came inside but immediately went to the front door, scratching at it and whining. Sarah collapsed onto her father's couch and called Mercy General Hospital. After being transferred 3 times and pleading with the staff, she finally got limited information. Robert Mitchell had been admitted with a severe heart attack and was currently in surgery. That was 5 hours ago. No updates since then. "Can I come see him? I'm his daughter," Sarah begged. "Once he's out of surgery and stable, yes. We'll call you with updates. Are you the emergency contact we have on file?" Yes, that's me. Please call me the second you know anything. Sarah hung up and buried her face in her hands, letting the tears flow freely. Duke immediately came to her, resting his head on her knee, offering comfort even in his own distress. She wrapped her arms around his neck and sobbed into his fur. He's going to be okay, Duke. He has to be okay, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince the dog or herself. As evening fell and darkness crept across the neighborhood, Sarah tried everything to settle Duke down. She fed him his favorite treats. He sniffed them and walked away. She put on the TV to Robert's favorite channel. Duke ignored it completely. She tried taking him for a short walk around the block, hoping familiar territory would calm him, but Duke pulled constantly toward the park, toward the place he'd last seen Robert. By 10 p.m., both Sarah and Duke were exhausted but unable to rest. Sarah lay on the couch, her phone clutched in her hand, waiting for news from the hospital. Duke lay near the front door, his head on his paws, his eyes open and alert, watching, waiting. Around midnight, Sarah finally dozed off from sheer emotional exhaustion. She woke 2 hours later to a sound that sent ice through her veins, frantic digging coming from the backyard. She ran outside to find Duke in the corner of the yard, his powerful front paws working frantically at the base of the wooden fence. He'd already created a significant depression in the dirt, and wood chips were flying as his claws scraped against the bottom fence board. "Duke, no, stop," Sarah shouted, rushing toward him. But Duke was beyond listening. Something primal had taken over, an instinct that told him Robert needed him, that he had to find his way back to his owner no matter what obstacles stood in his path. When Sarah tried to pull him away from the fence, Duke actually growled, something she'd never heard him do in 5 years. Shocked and frightened, Sarah backed away. Okay, I'm sorry, boy, I know you're upset, I know." She stood there in her pajamas in the cold October night, watching helplessly as Duke continued his desperate excavation. After 20 minutes, she tried approaching again, this time slowly, speaking in her voice. "Duke, please, come inside. Please, buddy, you can't get out, you'll get lost. How will Dad find you if you're lost?" At the mention of Dad, Duke paused and looked at her, his eyes reflecting the porch light, filled with confusion and desperate hope. Sarah's heart shattered. She managed to coax him inside with the promise of Robert's old sweatshirt, which she retrieved from the laundry. Duke immediately buried his nose in it, inhaling deeply, and for the first time since morning, he seemed to relax slightly. He carried the sweatshirt to Robert's bedroom and curled up on the floor beside the bed, the shirt tucked under his chin. Sarah watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Duke, I miss him too. We'll see him soon. I promise we'll see him soon." But it was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. And as she lay awake in the guest room, listening to Duke's occasional whimpers through the wall, Sarah had no idea that her father's loyal companion was already planning his escape, driven by a devotion that would soon amaze the entire world. Sarah woke with a start at 6:15 a.m., disoriented and groggy from only 3 hours of fitful sleep. Her phone had buzzed with a text message from the hospital. "Mr. Mitchell stable post-surgery. ICU visitation 10 am 8 p.m. Immediate family only." Relief flooded through her body so intensely that she actually gasped. Her father was alive. He'd made it through surgery. Tears of gratitude streamed down her face as she clutched the phone to her chest. She wanted to call the hospital immediately for more details, but she knew she had to wait until normal business hours. Then she remembered Duke. Sarah quickly threw on her clothes and hurried to her father's bedroom, expecting to find the golden retriever still curled up with Robert's sweatshirt. But the room was empty. The sweatshirt lay abandoned on the floor, and Duke was nowhere to be seen. "Duke," Sarah called out, walking through the house. "Duke, where are you, boy?" The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Growing concerned, Sarah checked the bathroom, the basement, every closet. No Duke. Her heart began racing as she rushed to the back door and flung it open. The backyard gate was still latched shut, exactly as she'd left it. But Duke wasn't on the porch or anywhere in the yard that she could see. Sarah's stomach dropped as she stepped fully outside, scanning the space. That's when she saw it. In the far corner of the yard, where Duke had been digging the night before, there was now a gap beneath the fence, a tunnel of sorts that hadn't been there when she'd finally gotten him inside. The dirt was freshly disturbed, scattered across the grass in dark clumps. Tufts of golden fur clung to the rough wood of the fence's bottom board, and small spots of blood marked where Duke's determination had overcome the obstacles of wood and wire. No, 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 no. Sarah ran to the fence, dropping to her knees to examine the escape route. The gap was barely large enough for a dog Duke's size to squeeze through, but somehow he'd managed it. She could see the drag marks in the dirt where he'd pulled himself under, the desperate scratches his claws had left in the earth. Sarah's mind raced. Duke was loose somewhere in the neighborhood, probably trying to get back to Riverside Park, the last place he'd seen Robert. But the park was over 3 miles away, through busy streets and intersections. Duke had never been off-leash in the neighborhood before. He could get hit by a car, picked up by animal control, or simply get lost in the sprawling suburbs. She grabbed her phone and started making calls while jogging back inside to get her car keys. First, she called Mrs. Duke escaped. He dug under the fence sometime during the night. I'm going to drive around looking for him, but if you see him, please call me immediately. Oh dear, of course, Sarah. I'll walk the neighborhood and ask everyone to keep an eye out. Don't worry, we'll find him. Next, Sarah called the county animal control and reported Duke as missing, providing detailed information. Golden Retriever, 7 years old, wearing a blue collar with tags, answers to Duke, extremely friendly but likely distressed and anxious. Then she got in her car and began driving slowly through the neighborhood, windows down, calling Duke's name every few seconds. Duke, Duke, come here, boy. She drove to Riverside Park first, thinking that would be his most likely destination, but there was no sign of him. The morning joggers were out, and Sarah stopped several of them, showing photos of Duke on her phone, asking if they'd seen him. No one had. For 2 hours, Sarah searched. She drove every street within a 2-mile radius of her father's house. She stopped at every park, every store, every gas station, showing Duke's picture to anyone who would look. Her voice grew hoarse from calling his name. Her eyes burned from crying and lack of sleep. By 8:30 a.m., Sarah had to make an impossible decision. She had to go to the hospital to see her father. He would be awake soon and would want to know what happened, would want to know about Duke. But how could she leave while Duke was missing? How could she tell her father that she'd lost his beloved companion? She sat in her car outside a 7-Eleven, her head resting on the steering wheel, feeling like a complete failure. Her phone rang. It was her husband, Mark, calling from their home in Columbus. "Any news?" he asked gently. "I can't find him, Mark. I've looked everywhere. He's just gone." Sarah's voice cracked. "Dad's going to be devastated. Duke is his whole world. How do I tell him I lost his dog?" "Sarah, listen to me. You didn't lose Duke. Duke left because his instincts told him to find Robert. That dog is smart and he loves your dad more than anything. You need to go to the hospital and be with your father. I'm getting in the car right now. I'll come to Cleveland and keep searching for Duke. I'll coordinate with the neighbors, call all the shelters, put up posters, whatever it takes." Sarah wiped her tears, grateful for her husband's steady presence. Okay, you're right, thank you. I love you, now go be with your dad. We'll find Duke, I promise." Meanwhile, Duke was on a journey of his own, driven by forces he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. He had followed his nose through the dark pre-dawn streets, retracing the route he'd walked with the day before, but in reverse. Every few blocks, he would stop and lift his nose to the air, processing thousands of scent molecules, searching for the one that mattered most, Robert's scent mixed with the sharp chemical smell of the ambulance. The journey was harder than anything Duke had ever experienced. His paws, usually accustomed to grass and sidewalks during leisurely walks, were now pounding against concrete for miles. Small cuts from squeezing under the fence stung with each step. His muscles ached. His throat was dry, but none of it mattered. Only Robert mattered. Duke crossed intersections during red lights, causing cars to slam on their brakes and honk. He squeezed through narrow gaps between buildings, his fur catching on chain-link fences and thorny bushes. Several people tried to approach him, calling out in friendly voices, but Duke avoided them all. He had a mission, and nothing would deter him from it. Around 7 a.m., a postal worker named James spotted Duke trotting down Euclid Avenue, clearly on a determined path. James, an animal lover who had 3 dogs of his own, immediately noticed that Duke was moving with purpose. This wasn't a dog wandering aimlessly. This was a dog who knew exactly where he was going. James pulled his mail truck alongside Duke and rolled down his window. "Hey there, buddy. You okay? You look like you've been through something." Duke glanced at him but didn't slow down, his golden paws carrying him steadily forward. James noticed the collar and tags. He reached into his lunch bag and pulled out a piece of turkey sandwich, hopping to lure the dog close enough to check the tags. "Want a treat, boy? Come here." For a moment, Duke hesitated. The smell of food reminded him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. But then a breeze shifted, carrying with it a faint scent that made Duke's entire body go rigid with attention. It was the smell of antiseptic and medicine, hospital smell. And buried beneath it, impossibly faint but unmistakable, was Robert's scent. Duke took off running, his exhaustion forgotten, his pace quickening to a full sprint. James watched in amazement as the golden retriever practically flew down the street, turning the corner onto Carnegie Avenue. "Where is that dog going in such a hurry?" James muttered to himself, making a mental note to call animal control about a possible lost dog in the area. Duke ran for another 15 minutes, his tongue hanging out, his breathing labored but his determination unwavering. And then, as he crested a small hill on Carnegie Avenue, he saw it, the massive building with the Red Cross symbol, the parking lots full of cars, the ambulance bay with its distinctive markings. Mercy General Hospital. Every instinct Duke possessed told him that Robert was in there, somewhere behind those walls. He couldn't see him or hear him, but he could sense him, the way he'd always been able to sense when Robert was coming home, even before the car pulled into the driveway. Duke's pace slowed to a trot as he approached the main entrance, his exhausted body finally catching up with his determination. His paws were bleeding now, leaving small red prints on the pavement. His beautiful golden coat was matted with dirt, sweat, and dried blood from the scratches he'd acquired during his escape and journey. The automatic doors of the hospital's main entrance whooshed open and closed as people came and went, visitors carrying flowers, medical staff in scrubs, patients in wheelchairs being pushed outside for fresh air. Duke studied the doors intently, watching each person who entered, hopping to see Robert walk out. But Robert didn't come out. So Duke did the only thing he could do. He lay down directly in front of the entrance, positioning himself where he could see everyone who passed through those doors. He rested his head on his front paws, his amber eyes fixed unwaveringly on the entrance, and he settled in to wait. He would wait as long as it took. Because that's what love does. It waits, it endures, it never gives up. And Duke's love for Robert Mitchell was the kind that would move mountains, cross miles, and soon touch the hearts of millions. Johnson had worked as a security guard at Mercy General Hospital for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything. Medical emergencies, family drama, late-night incidents, nothing surprised him anymore. But when he started his shift at 3 p.m. on that Wednesday afternoon and saw the golden retriever lying motionless by the main entrance, something about the scene struck him as unusual. The dog wasn't begging for food or wandering aimlessly like strays sometimes did. He was positioned deliberately, his body aligned perfectly with the automatic doors, his head resting on his paws, his eyes locked on every person who entered or exited. There was an intensity in that gaze, a focus that found almost human in its determination. "Hey there, buddy," said gently, approaching slowly with his hands visible, a technique he'd learned after years of dealing with unpredictable situations. "You waiting for someone?" Duke's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and his eyes briefly flicked toward the security guard before returning to the doors. He didn't growl or show any signs of aggression, but he also didn't wag his tail or show any interest in interaction. He simply continued his vigil, as if wasn't even there. Notice the dog's condition, the matted fur, the dirt, the dried blood on his paws. This wasn't a dog that had just wandered over from the neighborhood. This was a dog who had been through something, who had traveled far with a purpose. "You're hurt, boy. Let me help you," tried again, this time pulling a granola bar from his pocket and breaking off a piece. He held it out, close enough for Duke to smell. Duke's nose twitched. He was hungry. He hadn't eaten in over 30 hours, but food seemed irrelevant compared to his mission. He turned his head away from the offering and repositioned himself, shifting his weight to get a better view of the doors. Stood there for a moment, puzzled and somewhat moved by the dog's single-minded dedication. He pulled out his radio. "Hey, this is at the main entrance. We've got a dog situation out here. Looks like somebody's lost pet, but he won't budge. Might need animal control." "Copy that. Want me to make the call?" Looked at Duke again, at those intelligent, determined eyes. Something told him this wasn't a typical stray situation. "Hold off for now. Let me see if I can figure out who he belongs to first. He's got a collar with tags." Knelt down carefully, moving slowly so as not to startle Duke. "I'm just going to look at your tag, okay, buddy? Just want to see who you belong to." Duke allowed to reach forward and gently lift the metal tag hanging from his collar. Squinted at the engraving. "Duke. If found, call Robert Mitchell," followed by a phone number. Pulled out his cell phone and dialed the number. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. "Hi, this is Johnson from Mercy General Hospital Security. I've got a dog here named Duke who's been sitting outside our main entrance. The tag has this number. If this is your dog, please give me a call back." He left his number and hung up. What didn't know was that the phone he'd just called was sitting in a plastic bag in the ICU nurse's station, along with Robert Mitchell's wallet, watch, and wedding ring. The personal effects that had been removed when Robert was admitted to emergency surgery. As the afternoon wore on, Duke became something of a fixture. Hospital staff coming and going for shift changes began to notice him. A few tried to approach with kind words and offers of water, but Duke remained focused on his task. He would acknowledge them with a brief glance, sometimes a slight tail movement, but he never took his eyes off those doors for more than a few seconds. By 5 p.m., the evening shift nurses were gathering near the entrance, watching Duke with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "He's been there for hours," told them. "Won't eat, barely drinks, just watching those doors like he's waiting for someone." Pediatric nurse, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a reputation for taking in strays, felt her heart squeeze at the sight. She'd always been drawn to animals in distress, and something about Duke's situation called to her on a deep level. "Has anyone checked if there's a patient here with the name from his tag?" asked. Shook his head. "Can't give out patient information, you know that. Besides, I called the number on the tag and left a message." Nodded, understanding the privacy regulations, but an idea was forming. During her break, she went to the cafeteria and got a bowl of water and some plain chicken breast from the salad bar. She brought them outside and placed them near Duke, not too close, respecting his space. "Hey there, sweet boy," she said softly, sitting down on the concrete a few feet away from him. "I don't know who you're waiting for, but you need to take care of yourself while you wait. Okay?" Duke glanced at the water bowl. His throat was parched. his mouth dry from panting during his long journey. After a moment of internal debate, he quickly lapped up some water, but he didn't touch the chicken. Then he immediately returned his attention to the doors, as if afraid he might miss Robert if he looked away for too long. Sat with him for 20 minutes, not saying much, just being present. She noticed how Duke's eyes followed every person in scrubs, how his ears would perk up whenever a man with gray hair appeared, how his whole body would tense with hope before relaxing again in disappointment when it wasn't who he was looking for. "You're looking for someone specific, aren't you?" whispered. "Someone you love very much." As if understanding, Duke let out a small whimper, the first sound he'd made since arriving at the hospital. That night couldn't stop thinking about Duke. When she got home to her apartment at 11 p.m., she found herself scrolling through her phone, looking at the pictures she'd secretly taken of the loyal dog keeping his vigil. There was something profound about his dedication, something that touched a place deep in her soul. On impulse, she opened Facebook and selected her favorite photo, Duke lying with perfect posture by the entrance, his golden coat catching the last rays of evening sunlight, his noble profile silhouetted against the hospital's glass doors. She typed a caption. "This beautiful golden retriever has been keeping vigil outside Mercy General Hospital's main entrance since this morning. He won't eat, barely drinks, and refuses to leave. Somewhere inside this hospital, his owner must be fighting for their life, and this loyal boy somehow knew to come here and wait. I've worked in healthcare for 15 years, and I've never seen devotion like this. If anyone knows this dog or his owner, please contact Mercy General Security. This is what true love looks like." Hesitated for just a moment before hitting post. She had about 300 friends on Facebook, mostly family and friends from nursing school. She hoped maybe someone would recognize Duke and help reunite him with his family. She had no idea she just lit a fuse that would ignite across the entire internet. Within an hour, her post had 50 shares. By midnight, it had 200. By 2 a.m., it had been shared over 1,000 times, spreading through Cleveland's interconnected community networks like wildfire. People who'd seen Duke during the day were commenting with their own photos and videos. "I saw him this afternoon. He wouldn't move for anyone. That's the most heartbreaking thing I've ever seen. Someone find this dog's owner." By dawn on Thursday morning, this post had escaped Cleveland entirely. It had been picked up by a popular animal rescue page with 500,000 followers, then by a viral content aggregator, then by local news monitoring services. When woke up at 6 a.m. to get ready for her shift, her phone was blowing up with notifications. Her post had been shared over 50,000 times. News outlets were requesting permission to use her photo. The comments section had grown to thousands of messages from people around the country, all moved by Duke's story. "Oh my God," whispered, sitting on her bed in her pajamas, scrolling through the overwhelming response. "What have I done?" But when she arrived at the hospital at 7 a.m. and saw Duke still in the exact same position, now entering his second full day of waiting, she knew exactly what she'd done. She'd told the world a story that needed to be told. She'd shone a light on a love so pure and uncomplicated that it reminded everyone what really mattered in life. Television news vans began arriving at the hospital by 8 a.m. WKYC, Fox 8, and Channel 19 all dispatched reporters and camera crews. Hospital administration was in emergency meetings, trying to decide how to handle the sudden media attention while respecting patient privacy and maintaining normal operations. By noon, Duke's vigil had become a full-fledged news event. Reporters were broadcasting live from the hospital entrance. "We're here at Mercy General Hospital, where a loyal dog has captured the hearts of millions online. Duke, as he's known from his collar tag, has been waiting outside this entrance for nearly 2 days, refusing to leave, seemingly knowing that his owner is somewhere inside fighting for their life." People started showing up at the hospital with donations, bags of dog food, blankets, toys, even small tents to provide shelter. Someone created a Duke Watch Facebook group that gained 10,000 members in its first hour. A local pet store offered to provide food and supplies for as long as Duke needed them. Found himself overwhelmed, trying to manage the crowds while protecting Duke and ensuring the hospital's emergency entrance remained accessible. The security team set up barriers to keep well-meaning visitors at a respectful distance, but Duke seemed oblivious to all the attention. His eyes never left those doors. Inside the hospital, patients and staff were talking about little else. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of loyalty, devotion, and unconditional love in a world that often seemed to lack all three. And through it all, Duke simply waited, his vigil unwavering, his faith unshakable. He didn't understand the cameras or the crowds or why so many strangers wanted to take his picture. He only understood one thing: Robert was in there somewhere, and Duke would wait at these doors until his best friend came back to him. Even if it took forever, Sarah Mitchell sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her father's ICU bed, holding his hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness. It was Thursday morning, nearly 48 hours since the heart attack, and the doctors said Robert was making remarkable progress. His vitals were stable, and they were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. But Sarah knew the moment her father fully woke up, his first question would be about Duke, and she still had no answer to give him. Her husband Mark had searched tirelessly, coordinating with neighbors, calling shelters, driving through every street in a 5-mile radius. Nothing. Duke had vanished completely, as if he'd simply disappeared into thin air. Sarah had barely slept, torn between staying with her father and searching for the dog who meant everything to him. "Sarah," Robert's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it made her jump. "Dad, oh thank God, how are you feeling?" She leaned forward, squeezing his hand gently. Robert's eyes struggled to focus, the medication making everything fuzzy and distant. Where am I?" "You're at Mercy General Hospital. You had a heart attack at the park, Dad. You had surgery, but you're going to be okay. The doctors say you're doing really well." Robert processed this information slowly, his brain working through the fog. Then his eyes widened with sudden panic. "Duke? Where's Duke? Is he okay? Who's taking care of him?" Sarah's throat tightened, and tears immediately sprang to her eyes. She'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her head, but now that the moment was here, the words wouldn't come. "Sarah," Robert's voice took on a desperate edge despite his weakness. "Where is my dog? Tell me he's okay. Please tell me he's okay." "Dad, Duke got out. He escaped from the backyard. We've been searching everywhere, but we haven't found him yet. Mark is still out there looking, and all the neighbors are helping, and I've called every shelter and—" "No," Robert tried to sit up, but the monitors began beeping and his face contorted with pain. No, he needs me. He'll be terrified, he has anxiety, he can't be alone. Sarah, you have to find him." "Dad, please lie back down, you just had major surgery, you can't." "I don't care about the surgery," Robert's voice cracked, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Duke saved my life after your mother died. He's not just a dog, Sarah. He's my family. He's my reason for getting up every morning. You have to find him, please." A nurse rushed in, alerted by the monitor alarms. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to calm down. Your heart rate is spiking. You're going to hurt yourself." But Robert couldn't calm down. The thought of Duke lost and alone, scared and confused, was more painful than any physical wound. He'd failed his loyal companion, the one being who'd never failed him. The monitors continued their frantic beeping as Robert struggled against the nurse's gentle restraint. "Please," he sobbed, looking at Sarah with such raw anguish that it broke her heart completely. "Please find my boy." Meanwhile, 2 floors below and completely unaware of the emotional scene unfolding in the ICU, was beginning her day shift in the pediatric ward. The first thing she did, as had become her routine, was check on Duke. She carried a fresh bowl of water and some scrambled eggs from the cafeteria, hoping today might be the day he'd actually eat something substantial. As she approached the entrance, she was stunned by what she saw. The crowd had grown even larger overnight. There were now at least 50 people standing behind the barriers, many holding phones and cameras. 3 news vans were parked in the visitor lot, and reporters were conducting interviews with people in the crowd. And in the center of it all, unchanged and unmoved, was Duke, still lying in his chosen spot, still watching those doors with unwavering attention. His vigil had entered its 3rd day. "Good morning, sweet boy," said softly, kneeling beside him with the food. "Still waiting for your person." Duke's tail gave a small thump of acknowledgement. He'd come to recognize as a friend, but his eyes never left the doors. Noticed his water bowl from yesterday was empty, which was encouraging. At least he was staying hydrated. As she sat with Duke, her phone buzzed with a call from the hospital's public relations director. "We need to talk about the situation outside. Can you come to my office before your shift starts?" 20 minutes later, sat across from Mercy General's PR director and Doctor, the hospital administrator. Both women looked exhausted, clearly having dealt with the media circus that Duke's story had created. "Your post has created quite a situation," said, though her tone wasn't accusatory. "We've had to assign additional security, we're fielding hundreds of media requests, and now there's a petition online with 200,000 signatures demanding we let Duke inside to see his owner." "I'm so sorry," said quickly. "I had no idea it would blow up like this. I was just trying to help find his family." Doctor held up her hand. "We're not blaming you. What you did was act with compassion, and frankly, the positive attention has been remarkable. The Today Show wants to do a segment. Ellen's people have called. But we have a bigger issue. We need to identify Duke's owner and resolve this situation." "I've been trying," explained. "Security called the number on his tag, but no one answered. The tag says Robert Mitchell. I've checked our patient database, and we do have a Robert Mitchell, but I can't access his records without authorization." Doctor and exchanged glances, pulled up something on her computer. "There is a Robert Mitchell currently in our cardiac ICU, admitted Tuesday morning with a severe myocardial infarction. He's 68 years old, lives on Maple Street." His heart began racing. "That's it, that has to be him. The timing matches perfectly. Duke showed up Tuesday morning, right? And he's been here ever since." "But we can't just assume," Doctor said carefully. "And even if we confirm it, hospital policy strictly prohibits animals except certified service animals. The infection risk, the potential to disturb other patients." "But this is extraordinary circumstances," argued, her passion overriding her usual professional deference. "That dog has traveled miles to get here. He's been lying on concrete for 3 days, refusing to eat, refusing to leave. If Robert Mitchell is upstairs right now, recovering from a heart attack, can you imagine what he's going through? Worrying about his dog. And can you imagine what Duke is going through, sensing his owner is in there but not understanding why they won't come out?" Pulled up her computer screen and turned it toward Doctor. "You need to see this. The hashtag Duke's Vigil is trending nationally. We're receiving donations to the hospital in Duke's name. 3 different animal welfare organizations have offered to help. A children's book author wants to write Duke's story. This isn't just a local news item anymore. This is a story that's resonating with millions of people." Doctor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on her desk. She was thinking about hospital regulations, liability issues, infection protocols. But she was also thinking about compassion, about healing, about the fact that she'd gone into medicine to help people, and sometimes helping people meant bending rules that seemed sensible in theory but cruel in practice. "What's Robert Mitchell's current condition?" she asked. Pulled up the information she'd been authorized to access. "Stable, recovering well from surgery, conscious and responsive as of this morning." "And his family situation?" One daughter on record as emergency contact, Sarah Mitchell. Doctor picked up her phone. Get me Sarah Mitchell on the line. Tell her it's regarding her father and that it's urgent but not a medical emergency. 10 minutes later, Sarah's phone rang just as she was leaving Robert's room to grab coffee from the cafeteria. Her father had finally calmed down enough to fall back into a medicated sleep, but his face was still wet with tears. Hello, Ms. Mitchell. This is Doctor, Administrator at Mercy General. I need to ask you an unusual question. Does your father have a golden retriever named Duke? Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Yes, he does. Do you know where Duke is? We've been searching everywhere. He escaped and we can't find him, and my dad is beside himself with worry. Ms. Mitchell, I need you to come down to the main entrance of the hospital, right now. Why, what's wrong? Is Duke okay? Just come down, and you might want to bring your phone to take a video. Trust me on this. Sarah practically ran to the elevator, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. What if Duke was hurt? What if something had happened to him? She burst out of the elevator on the ground floor and followed the signs to the main entrance. The moment she stepped outside, she understood. The crowd, the cameras, the barriers, and there in the center of it all, lying in patient devotion exactly where a viral photo had captured him, was Duke. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped. Duke. At the sound of her voice, Duke's head snapped up. His ears perked forward and recognition flooded his tired eyes. He knew that voice. That was Robert's daughter. That meant Robert was close. Duke stood up for the first time in hours, his stiff legs trembling slightly as he walked towards Sarah. But he didn't run to her the way he normally would have. Instead, he looked at her, then back at the hospital doors, then at her again as if asking a question. Is he in there? Is Robert in there? Sarah dropped to her knees and Duke came to her, letting her wrap her arms around his neck. His fur was matted and dirty, and she could feel his ribs more prominently than before. He'd lost weight in just 3 days. You found him, Sarah whispered into Duke's fur, her tears soaking into his coat. You knew where he was and you came here. Oh, Duke, you amazing, loyal, incredible boy. Cameras flashed all around them. News reporters spoke urgently into their microphones. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Sarah only had eyes for Duke, and Duke only had one thing on his mind. He pulled gently away from Sarah's embrace and looked up at her with those soulful amber eyes, then back at the hospital doors. The message was crystal clear. Take me to him, please. I've waited long enough. Sarah looked up to see a doctor standing in the doorway, watching the reunion. Doctor gave a single, decisive nod. Bring him in, she said. Let's reunite this family. Elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like it took an eternity, though it was only 30 seconds. Sarah stood with her hand on Duke's collar, feeling his entire body trembling with anticipation. Stood with them, holding the temporary visitor badge she'd clipped to Duke's collar, a small blue plastic card that read Visitor, Duke Mitchell. Your father doesn't know yet, Sarah told Duke softly, her own voice shaking. He thinks you're lost. He's been so worried about you, buddy, so worried. Duke's ears were perked forward, his nose working overtime as they rose through the building. The hospital smells were overwhelming. Antiseptic, medication, cleaning solutions, illness. But underneath it all, Duke was searching for one specific scent. Robert's scent. And with each floor they climbed, that scent grew stronger. When the elevator doors opened on the cardiac floor, Duke pulled forward with sudden urgency. Sarah had to tighten her grip on his collar to keep him from breaking into a run down the hallway. Easy, boy, easy. We're going to him, I promise, Sarah said, though her own heart was racing just as fast as Duke's. The nurses at the station looked up in surprise as the unusual procession passed. A golden retriever walking through the cardiac ICU was not something they saw every day, but had called ahead, and doctor had personally authorized this exception, so they simply watched with curious, emotional expressions. "Room 412, said softly, pointing down the hallway. "Third door on the right." Sarah's hand was on the door handle when she paused and looked down at Duke. "He's been through a lot, Duke. He's got tubes and wires attached to him. He looks different than you remember. But it's him, okay? It's your dad, and he's going to be okay." She pushed open the door. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. Robert was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of medicated rest. His face was pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Wires ran from his chest to various machines, and an IV line fed into his left arm. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile than Duke had ever seen him. For a moment, Duke stood frozen in the doorway, processing what he was seeing. This was Robert. His scent was unmistakable, that combination of Old Spice aftershave, coffee, and something uniquely him that Duke could have identified from a mile away. But he looked wrong, vulnerable, hurt. Then Duke's instincts took over. He let out a cry, a sound somewhere between a whine and a bark, filled with 3 days of worry, exhaustion, and overwhelming relief. It was a sound that came from the very depths of his soul, the vocalization of emotions too big for his canine heart to contain. Robert's eyes flew open at the familiar sound. For a moment, confusion clouded his face as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Then he turned his head toward the door, and time seemed to stop. "Duke," Robert's voice cracked, barely audible. His eyes filled with tears so quickly they spilled over immediately. "Duke, is that really you?" Sarah released Duke's collar. The golden retriever launched himself forward, forgetting his exhaustion, his sore paws, his empty stomach. Nothing mattered except getting to Robert. He reached the side of the bed and reared up on his hind legs, placing his front paws carefully on the mattress, mindful even in his excitement not to hurt Robert. Oh my God, you found me," Robert sobbed, reaching out with trembling hands to touch Duke's face, to run his fingers through that dirty, matted golden fur. How did you find me, boy?" Duke was making sounds Sarah had never heard before, whimpers and cries of pure joy mixed with distress at seeing Robert in such a state. He licked Robert's face frantically, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end was swaying. Then he tried to climb fully onto the bed, desperate to be closer. "No, Duke, down," Sarah started to say, worried about the IV lines and monitors. But Robert shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Let him up, please. I need him. I need to hold him." With Sarah's help, Duke carefully climbed onto the hospital bed, settling himself alongside Robert's body with remarkable gentleness, as if he understood his human was fragile right now. Duke pressed his face into Robert's neck, and Robert wrapped both arms around his dog, burying his face in Duke's fur. "I thought I'd lost you," Robert whispered brokenly. "I thought you were gone. I thought you'd think I abandoned you." Duke whimpered and pressed closer, his whole body molding against Robert's side. His tail never stopped wagging, thumping against the hospital bed in a rhythm of pure happiness. Stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, not even trying to hide them anymore. She pulled out her phone and began recording, not for social media this time, but because she knew this was a moment that needed to be preserved, a moment that captured something profound about love and loyalty. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, watching her father and his dog, and felt something break open inside her chest. She'd spent 3 days searching for Duke, 3 days watching her father's heart break over losing him, and now here they were, reunited in a way that seemed almost miraculous. "Dad, Duke has been waiting outside the hospital since Tuesday morning," Sarah said through her tears. "He somehow found his way here, 3 miles through the city, and he's been lying outside the main entrance for 3 days straight. He wouldn't eat, barely drank water. He just waited for you. The whole story went viral. Millions of people have been following his vigil." Robert pulled back just enough to look into Duke's amber eyes, his hands cradling the dog's face. "You waited for me. You came all this way and waited." Duke licked Robert's nose, his tail wagging even harder if that was possible. "That's my boy," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my good, loyal, perfect boy. I'm here, I'm okay. We're together now." The door opened slightly, and Doctor peered in, her professional demeanor cracking as she took in the scene. She'd approved this reunion with some trepidation, worried about hospital protocol and potential complications. But watching Robert Mitchell, whose heart rate had been elevated and irregular all morning, suddenly show normal sinus rhythm on the monitor, his vital signs stabilizing before her eyes, she knew she'd made the right call. "How are we doing in here?" Doctor asked softly. Robert looked up, his face transformed. The gray pallor was gone, replaced by color. The defeated slump of his shoulders had straightened. His eyes, which had been dull with depression and worry just an hour ago, now sparkled with life. "I'm perfect," Robert said, one hand still stroking Duke's fur. "Now I'm perfect." Doctor nodded, checking the monitors and making notes on her tablet. "Your vitals have improved significantly in the last 10 minutes, Mr. Mitchell. It seems Duke is better medicine than anything we can prescribe." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "He can stay for an hour, but then he'll need to go home with your daughter. You need rest, and Duke clearly needs food, a bath, and his own rest." "An hour," Robert repeated, looking back at Duke. "That's okay, buddy. We've got an hour. That's enough for now." But it wasn't just an hour. For the next 60 minutes, Robert talked to Duke the way he'd done thousands of times before, telling him about the surgery, about how scared he'd been, about how the first thing he'd thought when he woke up was, who's going to take care of Duke? Duke listened with rapt attention, his eyes never leaving Robert's face, occasionally licking his chin or nuzzling against his shoulder. Recorded several more minutes of footage, capturing the quiet moments between dramatic ones, Robert's hand absently scratching Duke's ears in that familiar way, Duke's contented sighs, the peaceful expression on Robert's face that had been absent since his admission. News of the reunion spread through the hospital within minutes. Nurses found excuses to walk past room 412. Other patients in nearby rooms, hearing the story, asked staff to wheel them past the doorway just to glimpse the famous dog and his owner. Even doctors who'd been skeptical about allowing an animal in the ICU found themselves pausing in the hallway, moved by what they witnessed. Outside the hospital, word spread even faster. Of the reunion, which she'd started recording and posting in real time with the family's permission, was viewed by over 200,000 people in the first 15 minutes. Comments poured in from around the world. "I'm crying at my desk at work, and I don't even care who sees. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. If you don't believe in unconditional love, watch this video. My faith in everything good has been restored." The major news networks picked up the footage within the hour. By evening, Duke's reunion with Robert would be featured on CNN, Fox News, ABC World News, and NBC Nightly News. The story would trend on Twitter for 3 days straight, but none of that mattered to the two souls lying together in room 412. When the hour finally ended and Sarah gently told Duke it was time to go, the dog visibly didn't want to leave. He pressed closer to Robert, his eyes pleading. "It's okay, buddy," Robert said, though his own voice was thick with emotion at having to say goodbye again. "You go home with Sarah. Get a good meal, a warm bath, sleep in a real bed. I'll be home soon. I promise I'll be home soon, and then we'll never be apart again. Okay?" Duke licked Robert's face one more time, then slowly, reluctantly climbed down from the bed. But he didn't walk away. He sat beside the bed, looking up at Robert, waiting. "Go on, Duke. Sarah's going to take good care of you, and I'll see you so soon." Sarah clipped the leash back on Duke's collar and gently tugged. Duke took one step, then looked back. Another step, another look back. By the time they reached the door, he'd looked back 7 times, each glance seeming to ask, "Are you sure? Are you really going to be okay without me?" Robert waved weakly from the bed, tears on his face but a smile breaking through. "I love you, buddy. I'll see you tomorrow." As Duke disappeared through the doorway, Robert let his head fall back against the pillow, exhausted but more at peace than he'd been since the moment he'd collapsed in the park. His faithful companion had found him against all odds, had waited for him with unwavering devotion, and had reminded him, and millions of others, what it truly meant to love someone with your whole heart. In the hallway, Duke walked slowly beside Sarah, his head hanging low, reluctant to leave. But something had shifted in him. He'd seen Robert. He'd touched him, smelled him, heard his voice. His person was hurt, but his person was alive. And that was enough to quiet the desperate anxiety that had driven him for 3 days. As they walked past the nurse's station, every staff member stopped what they were doing to watch the famous golden retriever pass by. Several were openly crying. One nurse pulled out her phone and captured a photo as Duke turned back one last time to look toward room 412, his eyes full of love and longing. "Don't worry, Duke," said softly as they passed. "He's going to be just fine. You saved each other." And in that moment, truer words had never been spoken. 3 weeks after the reunion that captured the world's attention, Robert Mitchell walked through his front door with Duke pressed against his side, refusing to be more than 6 inches away from his owner. The October morning was crisp and beautiful, the same kind of morning that had started their ordeal, but everything felt different now, brighter somehow, more precious. "Welcome home, Dad." Sarah's children, Emma and Jack, burst through the doorway with a handmade banner that read, "Welcome home, Grandpa and Duke," in colorful crayon letters decorated with hearts and dog bones. Robert's eyes filled with tears, something that happened much more easily these days. "Thank you, sweethearts, this is perfect." Duke's tail wagged as the children gently hugged him, careful like their mother had taught them, knowing that both Grandpa and Duke had been through something big and needed to be treated with care. Duke licked Emma's face, making her giggle, that beautiful sound that reminded Robert why life was worth fighting for. The doctors had wanted to keep Robert longer, but his recovery had been remarkable, unprecedented, Doctor had called it. She told Robert privately that she believed Duke's visit had been a turning point in his healing. "The will to live is powerful medicine," she'd said, "and you had a reason to get better waiting for you." After that first reunion, Doctor had bent the rules further, allowing Duke to visit Robert every day for an hour. Each visit followed the same pattern. Duke would rush to the bed, Robert would hold him close, and both would seem to heal a little more. The nursing staff started calling them the miracle duo, and several had admitted that seeing their reunion had reminded them why they'd gone into healthcare in the first place. Now, as Robert settled into his favorite recliner with Duke's head immediately resting on his lap, he felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. He'd been given a second chance, not just at life, but at appreciating the life he had. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," Sarah said, sitting on the couch across from him with her laptop. "I've been trying to keep up with everything, but it's impossible. Duke's story has reached over 100 million people worldwide. Look at this." She turned the laptop around to show him a news segment from Good Morning America. The anchor was saying, "In a world that often feels divided and cynical, the story of Duke and Robert Mitchell has reminded us all of the simple, pure truth of unconditional love. Duke's 3-day vigil outside Mercy General Hospital has become a symbol of loyalty and devotion that transcends species." Robert watched, shaking his head in amazement. "All that just because this knucklehead wouldn't give up on me," he said, scratching Duke's ears affectionately. "It's more than that, Dad," Sarah said softly. "People needed this story. They needed to be reminded that love like this exists, that loyalty matters, that showing up for the people, or animals, we love is what makes life meaningful." Over the following weeks, The impact of Duke's story continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. Received a call from Mercy General's board of directors, informing her that they'd established the Duke's Heart program, a revolutionary initiative allowing therapy dogs to visit patients and permitting family pets to visit critically ill patients under specific medical guidelines. The program would be piloted at Mercy General and, if successful, rolled out to hospitals across the country. "Your Facebook post changed hospital policy nationwide," told Robert and Duke during a visit to their home, where she'd become a close family friend. "Duke didn't just find you. He opened doors for thousands of other patients to receive comfort from their pets during the hardest times of their lives." The ripple effects continued. A children's book author named Tors published Duke Waits, a story of loyalty and love, with all proceeds going to animal shelters. The book became an instant bestseller, introducing Duke's story to a new generation and funding the rescue of hundreds of sheltered dogs across the country. The county animal shelter, the same shelter where Robert had found Duke 5 years earlier, was flooded with adoption applications. People who'd been moved by Duke's story wanted to give other dogs a chance at the kind of bond Duke and Robert shared. In the month following the viral story, the shelter saw a 300% increase in adoptions. Jessica, the shelter worker who'd been there the day Robert adopted Duke, called him with tears in her voice. "Mr. Mitchell, we're empty. For the first time in 12 years, every single dog has been adopted. Duke's story did this. You two saved so many lives." Robert, holding the phone with one hand and petting Duke with the other, could barely speak. That's incredible. Would have loved that." He paused, thinking of his late wife. "You know, I think she sent Duke to me. I really do. And now he's helping other dogs find their people just like he found me." But perhaps the most profound impact was happening in Robert's own community. His neighbor, Mrs., started a weekly Walk with Purpose group in Riverside Park, where pet owners and their dogs gathered every Tuesday morning, the same day and time Robert had collapsed. The group raised money for cardiac research and pet adoption programs, turning tragedy into something beautiful and lasting. Robert eventually returned to his daily walks with Duke, though now they were never alone. People would stop them constantly, some wanting photos, others just wanting to thank them for their story, many sharing their own tales of loyal pets who'd changed their lives. Robert handled it all with grace and humility, always deflecting attention to Duke. "He's the hero, not me," Robert would say. "I'm just the lucky guy he decided to love." On a sunny November morning, exactly 6 weeks after the heart attack, Robert and Duke returned to their bench by the pond in Riverside Park, the one with its memorial plaque. Robert sat down slowly, still careful with his healing body, and Duke settled at his feet, his head resting on Robert's shoe in that familiar, comforting way. "We made it back, buddy," Robert said softly, looking out at the ducks gliding across the water. "There were moments I didn't think we would, but we did." Duke's tail thumped against the ground in response. A young couple approached hesitantly, a golden retriever puppy bouncing at the end of their leash. "Excuse me, are you Robert Mitchell? And is this Duke?" Robert smiled and nodded. "That's us. We just adopted Daisy here from the shelter last week," the woman said, tears already forming in her eyes. "We saw Duke's story and it inspired us to adopt instead of buying from a breeder. We wanted to thank you. Your story changed our lives." The puppy Daisy bounded up to Duke with the fearless enthusiasm of youth. Duke, patient and gentle as always, let the puppy climb on him and nibble his ears, his tail wagging in that easy, contented way. "Looks like Duke's story is still changing lives," the man said, watching the dogs play. After the couple left, Robert sat quietly, watching Duke interact with the world around him, greeting passing joggers, watching the ducks, occasionally looking up at Robert as if to make sure he was still there. And Robert realized something profound. Duke's vigil hadn't ended at the hospital. In a way, Duke had been keeping vigil over Robert for 5 years, watching over him, protecting him, giving him a reason to keep going when grief threatened to swallow him whole. "You've been waiting for me all along, haven't you?" Robert whispered. "Waiting for me to heal, waiting for me to smile again, waiting for me to remember that life is worth living." Duke looked up at him with those wise, amber eyes that seemed to understand everything. That evening, Sarah came for dinner as she did every Sunday. As they sat around the table, Sarah, her husband Mark, Emma, Jack, Robert, and Duke lying contentedly under the table, Robert raised his glass of water. "I want to make a toast," he said, his voice steady and strong. "To second chances, to loyalty, to the healing power of love, and to Duke, who reminded an entire world that sometimes the smallest acts of devotion can change everything." "To Duke," everyone chorused, and under the table Duke's tail thumped against the floor. After dinner, as the family gathered in the living room, Emma climbed into Robert's lap, carefully, the way everyone still did, and asked, "Grandpa, do you think Duke knew you were in the hospital? Like, really knew?" Robert looked at Duke, who was lying by the fireplace, his eyes already drooping with sleep after a long, happy day. "I think Duke knew the most important thing, sweetheart. He knew that love doesn't give up. He knew that when someone needs you, you show up, you wait, you stay. Even when it's hard, even when you don't understand everything, you don't abandon the people you love." "Is that why everybody cried when they saw Duke's story?" Emma asked. "I think people cried because Duke reminded them of something they'd forgotten," Robert said, stroking his granddaughter's hair. "He reminded them that in a complicated world some things are beautifully simple. Love is simple. Loyalty is simple. Showing up for each other is simple. We humans forget that sometimes, but dogs never do." That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Robert got ready for bed with Duke following his every step, just as he had every night for 5 years. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Robert understood with perfect clarity how blessed he was, how close he'd come to losing everything, and how a dog's unwavering faith had pulled him back from the edge. As Robert climbed into bed, Duke jumped up and settled beside him, something the doctors had said was fine now, good for both their mental health. Robert wrapped his arm around his faithful companion and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Duke. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for finding me when I was lost. Thank you for reminding me what matters most." Duke sighed contentedly and pressed closer, his warm body a comforting presence in the dark. Outside, the world continued to turn, and somewhere, Duke's story was still being shared, still inspiring people to adopt dogs, to love more deeply, to show up for each other in times of need. But in this quiet bedroom in Cleveland, Ohio, the story had come full circle. 2 broken souls who'd saved each other 5 years ago had been tested, separated, and reunited. They'd faced the ultimate challenge and emerged stronger, their bond now legendary but still, at its core, beautifully simple. A man and his dog, a dog and his man, together again exactly where they belonged. Robert's last thought before drifting off to sleep was of, and he could almost hear her voice, warm and loving, "See, honey, I told you that home wasn't complete without a dog's paw prints on the floor. Duke gave you both paw prints and purpose. He gave you everything." And in the peaceful darkness, with Duke's steady breathing beside him and his heart, both the physical one and the emotional one, finally healed, Robert Mitchell smiled and whispered one more time, "Good boy, Duke. You're such a good boy." Duke's tail gave one sleepy thump against the blanket, and together, they slept the deep, peaceful sleep of souls who'd found their way home.